Good morning, everybody. My name is Ashley Horan. I am the Executive Director of MUSJA, the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance. We are the statewide social justice and advocacy network for Unitarian Universalists here in Minnesota. And we also do work in multi-faith settings with secular movements for justice. And we are in relationship with lots of folks in the region and nationally in terms of justice work in faith-based communities. So excited to be here, and I am thrilled that this morning I get to welcome my friend and colleague, the Rev Kelli Clement, who is here with us. She is the Social Justice Minister at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, former Executive Director of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And I've asked Kelli here because there's some really important conversation happening nationally around abortion and reproductive justice, as we've seen this swath of really extreme bills happening in a number of states around the nation. So I've asked Kelli to come and tell us a little bit about her own congregation's response here locally in Minnesota, and to give us sort of a sense of the landscape. One of our goals today is to really talk about religion from a progressive religious perspective about abortion and reproductive justice. And Kelli is one of the wonderful people who is absolutely at the top of the short list to do that. So welcome, Kelli.
Thanks, Ashley. Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. Kelli, can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey and your work in reproductive justice over the years?
Sure, I will be glad to. I actually love to tell a call story or a creation story whenever it's possible. I was in a social justice class in seminary taught by Meg Riley. And Meg had given us the assignment that every person was to pick an issue, and we were going to follow that issue all through the semester and write a sermon about it and write an op-ed and create a class and so on. And so I picked the issue of Darfur. The humanitarian crisis, the genocide in Darfur, was right in the news at that time. And I thought, well, there'll be a lot to read and learn, and I'd like to learn about that. And Meg said, "That's great, Kelli, you can do that, and that's really a worthy issue, but what's your hook? What's going to get you up in the morning to do this work when you would so much rather not do the work, and really engage you?" And so I began to sort of think around about things, and the thing that I cared most deeply about, because of my own experience with abortion, was reproductive rights. But I thought, well, you can't be a religious person and do that. That's not possible. But then I found that I could. I found the network of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, as it was at that time, and I dug in, and it has, my ministry really feels very much grounded in that work as a lens. As you know, any justice issue can be a lens to view all of the other justice issues. You can view any justice issue through the lens of environmentalism, or the lens of economic justice, or the lens of racial justice. My lens is reproductive justice. And so that's how I come to it. And from a personal perspective, my life, I am the mom and wife and minister and daughter and mother and citizen human being that I am, because I had the opportunity to have a safe abortion by compassionate, caring professional providers when I needed it. So that's why I do the work. I want other people to have that opportunity.
Kelli, it occurs to me that it might be helpful to give a definition of what we mean when we say reproductive justice, because there are a lot of different terms and languages floating out there. But when you say you have a lens that is a repro justice lens, what do you mean by that?
Sure. I sometimes talk about reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice. And that is a fuller phrase than reproductive choice. But the frame of reproductive justice comes from communities of color, specifically women of color, who articulated that it was not just, is this the right time for me? Is this, where is this in my career? But if we do not have safe homes, safe neighborhoods, living wage jobs, affordable health care, excellent child care, great public schools, it's the full spiritual, political, economic, social fulfillment of women in their lives, and then being able to make a free and responsible choice whether or not to continue a pregnancy. That's the frame of reproductive justice. And so it definitely comes from women of color, and it really just gives a fuller understanding of what it means to be pro-choice. They are related, but they're not exactly the same. And I think women of color have definitely given us, certainly the movement for abortion rights was led by white women, and women of color are most disproportionately affected by the reduction in access to abortion, reproductive health facilities, and healthcare. That's what I want to say. So they've given us the way to think about that in a way that really brings in marginalized folks. I hope that makes sense.
That's super helpful, Kelly. Thank you. And we're going to actually talk a little bit more about language and framing in a little while. But I actually want to invite you to talk a little bit about sort of the current moment that we're in, both nationally and here in Minnesota, and then lead us toward what's happening at First Unitarian Society in regards to these issues, because I think it's such a fascinating story.
Sure, absolutely. So nationally, it's in the news every day. I mean, the news will just beat the heck out of you. You know, I mean, it really feels and I hear this from our people at First Unitarian Society. First of all, I just want to say right now that I just got a note that my connection is unstable. I think I'm okay.
You're okay now. You froze for 1 second and now you're good.
Okay. I think we have to be really careful. I have to be really careful in protecting myself from the daily news. I want to be informed, and also I'm aware that every time I pick it up and I get, what's that jolt of bad news? And it's a little shock to the system. That is by design. That is by design of people in who are leading us toward an authoritarian regime. More control, more reduction of rights, more reduction of access to things that make a quality life, ability to make our own choices. So I think that for me, that's the larger umbrella, is that's happening by design to keep us destabilized, so that people will want an authoritarian leader to put everything right. I can't stand it. Somebody make it right. Okay. At the same time, these folks who would like for us to live in a theocracy under one narrow reading of, under a patriarchal authoritarian system based in a particular theology, want to
Let's be clear, we're talking about Christian hegemony here too, right? I mean, this is a very Eurocentric, patriarchal, evangelical version of Christianity.
Right. And you and I both know plenty of evangelicals who don't subscribe to this, but it's white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism want to control women. That's just what it wants to do, right? And so what's the most important way to control women? To control the way that they are child bearers, that they're not allowed to make their own reproductive health care decisions. That's the most important way to control women. I remember the first time I saw a sign that it was a billboard in the South, and it said, contraception is, I don't know, ruins women's lives or something like that. And I thought, what the hell? I don't know, this was 2005 or something like that. And I thought, are you kidding me? People like that. But whoa, really like that. And I have to say this, I've said this for years, the Christian right that grew out of the moral majority wins every time at organizing. They win every time at organizing, because authoritarianism tells you what you ought to do. We want a debate, right? And that's important. We want ideas to come up and, well, tell me yours, I'll tell you mine. That's not what authoritarianism does. And so they win every time on organizing. I don't know if I got, where we are, right? So you have these laws that are designed to go up to the Supreme Court, to go up to Roe, to overturn Roe. And the book that I would recommend to everybody, if you want to read more about this, what's happening in the States, is the PostRo Handbook. I believe that's the title of it, the PostRo Handbook by Robin Marty, M-A-R-T-Y. Robin is a Minnesota-based writer. She does deep dive investigation into the so-called pro-life movement and the pro-choice movement, the movement for reproductive rights, and has written in the first of this book, it says, okay, Roe is going to fall. There are 4 ways that this can happen. 1 is likely, 2 and 3 are unlikely, and 4 is like, she sort of lays it out, and I can't repeat all of that. But it says it's coming. So what are you going to do, right? What's happening in Minnesota in response to all of these bans that are happening is that a group of activists in Minnesota said, you know what? We're going to unrestrict Minnesota. As these more and more restrictive bans came up, we are going to unrestrict Minnesota.
Can you give us a sample, Kelly, of what the kind of restrictions are that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. There are, so first let me point out the website, unrestrictmn.org. And I think we may show that at some point, but it's a great website and you can find all of the restrictions. Some of these are doctors must, only doctors can perform abortion care. Even when it is well within the scope of practice for a nurse practitioner, a nurse midwife, advanced care medical professionals. Even if it's medication abortion as opposed to surgical abortion. So there are four abortion clinics in the state of Minnesota, 1 in Duluth and 3 in the Twin Cities area. So, for example, if nurse practitioners or nurse midwives or physician's assistants were able to provide medication abortion, for example, people in greater Minnesota would have much better access to it. Doctors must provide a script that is mandated, the language is mandated by the state, by politicians. No other medical procedure does a doctor have to say language that's mandated by the state. A doctor must give this language. It is medically inaccurate. It points toward a connection, for example, between breast cancer and abortion. None exists. If a doctor thinks that it's dangerous for the patient to hear it or emotionally difficult for a patient to hear it, they have to do it anyway, or they could risk losing their license. A doctor must tell a patient seeking an abortion that the biological father of that pregnancy is obligated to pay child support. Even if it is a much wanted child, it's a couple that is working in this together, even if the doctor believes that it would be emotionally harmful to the person to hear it, they must do that. A law that we are particularly challenging says that any fetal tissue that is the result of abortion or miscarriage must be disposed of by burial or cremation. There's no public health reason, there's no medically necessary reason for that to happen. That all comes from a particular theological framework to which we at First Unitarian Society do not ascribe. And so we say that's not okay. So those are a few of them. If you're a minor, you must have the written permission of both parents, even if you're not in relationship with one or both of those parents. You have to find birth certificates, and even if you have an abusive relationship, and for some reason have not notified the authorities about that. And the only way to get around that is to get a judicial bypass. A minor has to go in front of a judge to get a judicial bypass for this most intimate decision. There's no other procedure related to pregnancy, including giving birth, that a minor has to get permission for. So those are a few. There are others, and they're really delineated on that website.
Thank you.
Yes.
So tell us about the process at First Unitarian about deciding to enter into this lawsuit. Tell us about how it was going to move forward, and some more specifics about the case.
Sure. So there are two things. There's this public education campaign, the unrestrictmn.org campaign, and you can find out about all that's going on. And sidelong with that is a lawsuit that is challenging these restrictions under the Minnesota Constitution. We're not going to the U.S. Constitution, because the Doe v. Gomez ruling in the Minnesota Constitution guarantees Minnesotans both the right to have an abortion and the right to decide to have an abortion without the government putting their thumb on the scale one way or the other.
Can you distinguish between those two things? What do you mean when you say the right to have an abortion and the right to decide to have an abortion?
Right. As I understand it, the government can't, through laws and mandates, make it harder for you to decide, to add things that would add shame and stigma, which is actually what these laws want to do. They can't make it more complicated for you to decide this most intimate decision of whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term. So let's say, for example, let me think how I can name that. They can't make it more difficult for you to get into the clinic, right? If you have to fight your way into the clinic. That's not a really great example. Well, the one about the judicial bypass, let me see how that applies, because you can have access, you can get access to have an abortion, but if you don't meet specific requirements, you've either got a felony or a misdemeanor conviction, or the doctor has a felony or misdemeanor conviction. And it doesn't have to do with what's best for public health. It has to do with how do we as a state want to make people able to make a free and responsible choice for that. And so it has to do with if the government puts their thumb on the scale, makes it more shameful, makes it more hoops to jump through, makes you have to sit through government mandated script, that's really trying to make you decide not to do it, right? I believe in that script. It does not say that abortion is much safer than childbirth. I believe that is correct. So it's not factual. It's not an even sense of informed consent, which is how the other side it frames that. Let me circle back a little bit to the lawsuit. And Ashley, you have to keep me on track, because as you can tell, I'll talk about this for hours. We First Unitarian Society were invited to participate in this lawsuit to bring a religious freedom claim, particularly about this mandate about the burial of fetal tissue, burial or cremation of fetal tissue. We believe that it is a violation of our conscience, that members of First Unitarian Society sometimes have abortions, and that frame assumes the level of personhood that we do not. There are other individuals and organizations that are challenging various other restrictions. Gender Justice in St. Paul is the local organization that is kind of bringing us together. And an organization out of New York, the Lawyering Project, which was founded by an attorney who argued in front of the Supreme Court the Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt case out of Texas that was challenging the so-called TRAP laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers. Those are the ones that say the hallways have to be a certain width and the broom closet has to be, blah, blah. That attorney won that case, and now they have a strategy to challenge a number of mandates in various states. Because of gerrymandering, it is very difficult to win an abortion rights affirming legislature in many states, but constitutions often provide more access. So that's why it's a lawsuit, and other folks are organizing for pro-choice politicians. Yes, for pro-choice politicians, both at the city level and the county level and state level and national level. So anyway, that's how we determine, because of our long history at First Unitarian Society of inviting Margaret Sanger to speak. She was supposed to give a talk in St. Paul, and they were worried about violence back in the day, and folks at First Unitarian Society Alliance said, come on over here. And out of that was born the Birth Control League, which eventually grew to become Planned Parenthood of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Long time activism around reproductive justice issues, long time support and preaching, and of course our whole lives, sexuality education. And so that's, our board decided that this was a good fit for us. So that's how we decided to do it.
And it was the board that made the decision then?
It was the board that made the decision. Because of legal strategy, we could not tell our congregation about it until the lawsuit had been filed. And the very first thing that our board wrestled with is, do we have the authority to decide on this on behalf of the congregation? Do we have the authority to take on the risk? We may have protesters. You put yourself in the line of fire and people can say some things. And we talked a lot about it. We talked a lot about security. We talked a lot about what's our responsibility. And ultimately they took the very bold and brave position to say, yes, we'll do this. And our congregation has been incredibly supportive of it. They're so delighted that we're doing this work and doing it with a lot of care around our own building security and online security and communication and all of that.
Have you gotten pushback yet?
Just a little bit. We were on WCCO and we were in the Strib, and certainly there were some things written about that. One of my favorite ones was that First Unitarian Society is no more a community of faith than are the Scientologists. So what do they have to say about anything? I thought that was pretty good. They tell me not to be disappointed if we don't have a lot of protesters at the door. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
And actually, this is a great segue, right? So you serve a traditionally deeply humanist congregation. And you've talked a little bit about, for example, that one of the main pieces of this lawsuit is fighting this disposal of fetal tissue piece of the law, because your definition of personhood does not align with what is embedded in that. I think it's really important for those of us who are in progressive spheres. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute here, which is that in my experience, the left really, really loves to talk about rights and justice, and we cite data and facts about how many people are impacted by XYZ issue, and abortion and reproductive justice are no different than that. And when we come head to head with folks on the other side of an issue, conservative folks most of the time, the theoretical framework is less important than the moral, values, emotion-based theological framework. And while I deeply believe that Unitarian Universalism has a theology, that the people in our congregations are theologians and can articulate those values and morals for themselves, we don't do that publicly very often. And I think often that's why we lose in the public debates. And so I'm really interested in talking both about language, kind of the language that we use and what is successful and not successful in talking about issues like abortion and reproductive justice, as well as, and I think probably this is the place to start, what is your theology of abortion and reproductive justice? How would you articulate that? Give us an example so we can learn from you in being
Sure, absolutely. It's challenging. It's challenging. I think any theology that fits on a bumper sticker is not robust enough for me. So the theology that life begins at conception seems way too pat, and leaves out any kind of nuance. Theology for me is about nuance, and that's the difference between authoritarianism and liberalism. So my theology, and I also think that sort of theology is very manipulative, right? It's much easier to care about the preborn than it is about living, breathing people who are complicated and have lives and have needs and are maybe not pure. I read a Christian theologian not very long ago who said, yeah, it's easier to care about the preborn because the widow and the orphan and the immigrant and those people have complicated lives and they have needs that society needs to provide. And the other is complete, pure innocence. And that is manipulative. That's manipulative. So I think it's really easy for folks to care about that. All right, so here's my response to life begins at creation. Life begins at inception, whatever that is, conception. Life began 3.5 billion years ago. Life began on this earth 3.5 billion years ago. And every new organism is a continuation of that life in some way, right? That is deeply awe-inspiring to me. And the lived experience of people and the stories that I have heard of people who are making the decision whether or not to continue a pregnancy, who have lost a pregnancy that they didn't want to lose, who are in so much difficulty managing the families that they have, in all of the incredible nuance of our lived experience that is holy and blessed and sacred and deserves our love and compassion just as much as the person who wants to be pregnant and can't get pregnant, or has just welcomed a baby into the world, whether it was planned or unplanned. I mean, every single one is different, and that to me is the theological wonder of complexity. I also have a theological understanding that human beings are moral agents, and we receive our guidance in lots of ways. Some of us are in conversation with the holy a lot of the time. Some of us are in conversation with each other a lot of the time. Some of us listen to the still small voice within. Some of us in our Zen practice or in our Christian practice or in centering prayer, we hear the voice of love, or the voice of reason, or the voice calling us to our best selves in many ways. And in every religious tradition, there is scripture and language and story that points to human beings as moral agents who are given a brain, a heart, a conscience to help lead us to our best lives, to our best selves, to our best sense of service. That's a theological commitment for me. And so I don't think that I think that lives with nuance for me. And also in terms of religious freedom, somebody is absolutely welcome to believe that life begins at conception or implantation or wherever else, a quickening, wherever else along the way they may think it. And yet they don't have the right to impose that on someone else who is making that decision. They may well believe that the fetal tissue that's a result of their own experience, they would like to have it buried or cremated. All blessings on that decision. They don't have the right to decide that for someone else. And that's the religious freedom claim. Because I don't want to impose my decision on someone else. And that, to me, that's an emotional, not only a rights piece, but emotional piece. I want the same freedom for everyone that I have for myself.
Yeah. And a piece that you touched on, but I want to lift up that's part of my own theology of this is the sacredness and holiness and autonomy of our bodies, right? This understanding that we were made for life and flourishing and wellness and wholeness, and that, in fact, those of us who live in the bodies that we live in are actually best equipped to make the decisions that will, as you said, pull us toward more life and more flourishing. And that, and again, it's not just about choice and rights, but it's about this inborn sacredness, the holiness of our physical incarnations, right? And when you start chipping away at that, you end up with slavery, you end up with rape culture, you end up with so many things, economic devastation, all of these things that mean that people are separated from their ability to make the choices that are the best for their own bodies.
Right. It's the colonization of the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on our best days, we aspire to a decolonizing faith, and that means in the most intimate ways, right? When people with uteruses who are pregnant get to make those decisions. I also want to just highlight here, we've used a few times the language of women as people who are pregnant. We also know that there are more people than identify as women who get pregnant. And in fact, queer, non-binary, trans folks are not at all incidental to this conversation, right? I mean, the targeting and colonization and direct infringement on the bodies of queer, trans, non-binary people who do not necessarily identify as women is really important in this conversation too. There's less sort of public discourse about that, but I think it's really important for us to be clear that this is about more than just women as a class, although that certainly is an important piece of this too.
I think that's true. And certainly patriarchy wants people to be in their assigned roles. And I absolutely hear what you're saying, and held with that is the devaluation of women.
Yes.
That if you're not, and it devalues men, of course, too. And obviously queer, binary, non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, it also really compartmentalizes this. You don't exist because you don't fit in these exact roles. And if you're not a man, and if you're not a white man, if you're not a wealthy white man, you're progressively down the list. And so I often think of how we speak inside the house and outside the house. And so the targeting of women and wanting women to be in their place is a lot about how these laws are constructed. It is about controlling women and obviously anybody else who doesn't fit into the frame. But I think your point is well taken, that we're using more often the language of people who are making decisions whether or not to be pregnant, people who are pregnant, people, that frame. But I think it is worth remembering that the authoritarian frame is targeting women.
Absolutely.
And obviously it's targeting all of the other people. I don't want to diminish that in any way, but I think it's important to hold.
It's an and. Yes. And this is where our ability to hold complexity and nuance is really important.
Right. And that speaks back to what you were saying before about our opposition wants it to be very simple. There are men, there are women, they're different, and women should be pregnant or carry pregnancies to term or just keep their legs closed, and that's it.
Well, and even that frame is supportive of patriarchy in some way, right? Like when we play into that, the idea that, so the right has this idea that womanhood equals the ability to bear children. and to do that to the extent to which the men in control want that to happen, right? And so when we start complicating that, when we start disentangling womanhood from fertility and childbearing, it just like explodes the minds of people who are really trying to stick in that frame. And so I actually think it is important to have that nuance. And of course, we're strategic about when we use what language and in what places, which is actually a really great segue into this kind of conversation about language. You know, you've used a number of different terms in terms of reproductive justice, reproductive rights, reproductive choice. Can you just weigh in a little bit on kind of how, as progressive people of faith, the language that we have used has either helped or hindered our ability to be effective in working for more reproductive freedoms?
Well, I think one thing in particular is that we've not wanted to use the word abortion. You know, we call it the procedure or, you know, the pregnancy or the whatever, and we've not wanted to use the term abortion. And abortion is not a dirty word. It's healthcare. It is, abortion is healthcare, and healthcare is a right. It's an incredibly safe procedure, and millions of women, perhaps 1 in 3 in the United States, have had an abortion. It has changed the public landscape, and it has been, abortion and contraception have been boons to public health. So I think one thing is just saying that. I don't think there's one way to talk about reproductive health, rights, and justice. That's usually the longer phrase that I use. I don't think there's anything especially wrong with using the phrase pro-choice. I do not use the phrase pro-life unless I preface it with so-called, but I often refer to it as anti-choice because it's not about life. It is about a particular type of control. If we really wanted to reduce the rate of abortion, we know how to do that. And that is to have excellent, comprehensive sexuality education for every human being in the country, to have robust reproductive health care services, to have great contraception available. Thank goodness for the Affordable Care Act, but we could do better even about contraception. To make abortion a part of the healthcare that everyone receives. And when you do that, and especially sexuality education, the more sexuality education that our young people have, the longer they go and delay the onset of sexual activity, of intercourse anyway, and pregnancy rates come down. I mean, you can look at the countries that do that. So I don't use the phrase pro-life. I think it's manipulative. It's manipulative.
Can I ask you a specific question that I've actually heard you talk about, which is in the recent swath of bans that have come out, there's been major public outcry about how there's no exception for rape and incest. Can you talk about respectability politics and why that is not helpful language?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking that question. It is true that the abortion bans in Alabama, I think Alabama is the most restrictive, but certainly in Georgia and other ones. And you often hear this phrase, well, there's an exception for rape or incest, or in the case of Alabama, no exception for rape or incest. Horrible, truly, truly terrible. Many things about that ban are terrible. But when we buy into that narrative, when we repeat that narrative, it says that some abortions are okay and others are not. That if you have to have an abortion because of rape or incest, well, okay, and others are not. That is false, I believe. I think that because we've talked about the whole panoply of reasons that a person may decide not to continue a pregnancy, to have an abortion, we dare not privilege only the cases of rape and incest. Here's the deal. If you don't have a really hard case like that, well, you have to go ahead and carry the pregnancy to term. And so your punishment is to have a child. What? Children are not punishment. We don't force people to have children to be punished. right? And so that's the problem to me with that language. I like the way you say it, respectability politics. I try not to use that language anymore, or forward those posts that say, oh, look how horrible this is. All of the bans are horrible. If abortion is legal but you can't get it, there's no access, legality doesn't matter. And so, the constant chipping away, as you said.
And for many years, there's sort of been a wing of the quote unquote pro-choice movement that has used the tactic of, safe, legal, and rare, right? Yeah. Like the idea that actually we're not pro-abortion either. We don't want anybody to ever have an abortion. And I think it's actually really important what you're saying around, as humans who are capable of getting pregnant, there will always be unintended pregnancies. And the idea that we can certainly, drive those numbers down so that people don't get in those places. But the idea that we're like, oh, we're actually on the same side as you. We don't think abortion is great. Like, I don't think that's that helpful.
I don't think it's that helpful either. And I think that also, as you say, it's been buying into that other frame. I am pro heart transplant. I'm pro kidney transplant. I'm pro gallbladder surgery. I don't want to have any of those things. I'm not eager to wake up in the morning and have my gallbladder removed, but I'm really glad that the technology exists. And if I need that I'm able to access excellent, professional, compassionate healthcare. As long as people get pregnant, there will be unintended pregnancies, and there will also be pregnancies that don't develop the way that a viable pregnancy does. And so that's because that's because all of life is not exactly perfect. It's nuanced, and it develops in ways that are non-normative. And so some of those non-normative ways are incompatible with life. And some are. And if someone wants to continue a pregnancy that looks like it will be incompatible with life, God bless them. May they have peace in their decision and the way that comes forward. It should not be, no one else should get to make that decision. So the state or anybody else.
Thank you. Yes, so helpful. I want to ask sort of broadly, what do you think that the role of progressive people of faith is in this conversation, in this political moment? What can those of us who are not aligned with that extremely conservative Christian patriarchal view do, and how can we be people of faith in public around these issues?
Well, I think we need to preach and evangelize. I come from the South, and I think progressive people of faith, because we believe that faith is private in some ways, it's an internal conversation and maybe a communal conversation with those people who are smart enough to find us. And or we want to be out, rah, 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 which is important. I like the rah, rah, rah. But I think we need to learn to be able to talk about it. I think we need to practice talking about it in the same way that we practice talking about challenging white supremacy. We need to be able to get it wrong a little bit. I mean, you can't do reproductive justice work. You can't do racial justice work as a white person. I can't without getting it wrong. I'm absolutely going to get it wrong. So inviting people to practice talking about it. I never thought that I would have to share my own abortion story. Why would you have to share that most intimate conversation? Or my miscarriage story, or my infertility story? Never thought I'd have to share that. It's intimate, it's personal. There's a certain amount of shame that is wrapped around it. And I think our feeling of holding that close, protecting it a little bit, as intimate has been co-opted by the right to be shameful around abortion. I am not ashamed of my abortion. I am grateful that I had the opportunity to have that abortion when I did, because I can be the mom I want to be now. And I don't know, I wouldn't have the child that I have now if I had been forced to carry that other pregnancy to term, if I had not had an abortion. I don't know why my daughter's life is any less valuable than that previous pregnancy that was terminated. What can we do? We can learn to tell our stories. If it feels safe to tell your story, and you can learn to speak it without shame, that is an important thing to be able to do. This happened to me, and I want other people to have the right to terminate a pregnancy, to have an abortion. This happened to me. I had a miscarriage, and here's what it was like. And I don't think that fetal tissue should have to be buried because that doesn't feel right to me, or whatever the case is. Learn to tell that story. Learn to say, for men, it's really important for men to be able to say, I can't get pregnant if we're talking about cisgender men who are not trans men. I want to make sure I'm making mistakes around the language as well. To be able to say, if I can't get pregnant, I want the people that I love to be able to have access to safe, legal, compassionate, professional care. What else can we do? We can talk about it. We can vote about it. We can tell our elected officials from City Hall on up that we care deeply about there being unrestricted access to abortion care in the state of Minnesota or in the country. We can talk to our relatives about it, and that can sometimes be really difficult if you have relatives or friends who are conservative. How do you talk about that? You can say, I will listen to your point of view if you will listen to mine. And when they say things that I don't agree with, I'll say, that's not my theology. I don't agree with that. It's fine for you to have that, but that you don't get to impose that on me. We live in a country where you don't get to impose that on me. And be able to stand up to it and not just avoid it completely. And sometimes that's not safe to do, but when we can, we do that. What I've learned in the movement is of 100% of people, there's about 20% of people like me who think abortion should be available almost all of the time, right? There's about 20% of the people who think abortion should never, ever be available. That leaves about 60% of the people in the middle. I'm not going to get anywhere talking to that 20% of the people. Those are the people who might be able to, I might be able to find some values in common ground with. So finding values, shared values. Do you think religious freedom is important? Do you think it's important for human beings to make their own decisions? Do you think human beings are able to make their best decisions? That's some of the way we can practice that.
In terms of folks who want to show up in really concrete ways right now, are there ways that folks can either support our local facilities and organizing, or ways that folks can get involved in supporting this lawsuit that's going forward, et cetera?
Right. There aren't a lot of ways to support the lawsuit itself right at this moment, but people can always write op-eds. We would love to have people talk about it, speak about it in everywhere from the small local neighborhood newspaper up to the statewide papers and the national papers, and blogging and that sort of thing is any way you can share the message is really important. And on the website unrestrictmn.org, there is a link to get involved, and so there are some ways to do that. As Unitarian Universalists, who I think is most of who's going to see this video, if you want to, anybody could send me an email at First Unitarian Society, and I would let you know when we're doing some trainings or some things like that. I am going to be speaking in Rochester in July and in Duluth in August. And so I'll be in those places. I am going to be available to come to some other congregations. If you would like for me to do so, you can just reach out and let me know. Ashley, can you share my email
Yes, I will include. We're going to send the video of this out to our list, and we will also put it up on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And I will put unrestrictedmn.org on there, and I will talk to you about which of those things you want your personal email attached to.
Okay, great. And this is my FUS email, so so those things can come. There's going to be a couple of trainings from Unrestrict Minnesota to help if people really want to be spokespeople for it, or show up at one of the open streets rallies and man the person the booth, or we may have a booth at the state fair. This campaign goes really across the summer, and so they're showing up at a lot of local summer festivals and events. And so if you're in Greater Minnesota and want to do one of these things, please let me know, and I'll see if I can't hook you up to one of the things that's going on. In terms of financial support, certainly the campaign will welcome financial support. I think there's a way to donate on the website. And there are a few organizations that I would talk about that are always in need of support around this work. One is Our Justice, O-U-R, Justice. This used to be known as Pro-Choice Resources, and it's the Minnesota Abortion Fund. So for people who have difficulty either affording the procedure or affording the travel time, the transportation, the lodging, the childcare, all of the things that go around making access to abortion restricted. Our Justice is that abortion fund, and I can't say enough good about them. I think they do amazing work. So you can find them.
Can I just ask you, will you just say a word about abortion funds nationwide and sort of what they do and where they are? Because I know folks are also interested in thinking about abortion funds in some of the states where the restrictions are coming down.
Right. And I think, I should have these acronyms right at my head. Most states.
National Network of Abortion Funds, I think.
Yes, NANAF. I think that's it. National Network of Abortion Funds. And if you were to Google abortion fund in Alabama or abortion fund in Georgia or, wherever, you would find one or more. I think in Texas there are several, and they do exactly this. They receive money and they give money for people who are seeking abortions, for not only the procedure itself, but for some of the other things that come with it. And as we know, the longer you wait into pregnancy, or if we know, the longer you wait into pregnancy, the more expensive the procedure becomes. But because of all the barriers that are put up, the 72-hour waiting period in some places, 24 in Minnesota, you might have to make 2 appointments or take several days off of work or whatever it is. If you can't scrape the money together, then the longer you wait into pregnancy, the more expensive it gets. Because the procedure is more complicated the longer you go into pregnancy. It's still a safe procedure, but you want to do it sooner than later if you can make that decision. So that's what abortion funds do. They help people get access to abortions, and they're great. They're great.
Yeah, that feels like a really important thing to say, because some of us, the most impactful thing we can do is just send some money. And I would also encourage people to think about becoming monthly sustainers rather than sort of one-time gifts, because these funds, often we find that organizations that are working for reproductive justice and abortion care will get this giant influx of money when something is up in the news, but then they struggle when it's out of people's minds, right? And so just like with any sort of justice-oriented giving, that kind of consistent relationship is really important.
Right, absolutely. There are a number of other organizations that are doing great work. There are a lot of organizations that are co-sponsors of the Unrestricted Minnesota campaign. So Our Justice is one. Family Tree Clinic is another, which just does fantastic, comprehensive reproductive health care. They are not an abortion provider, but they do a lot of sexuality education. They do a lot of trans, non-binary, queer education and sexuality care. And so I think they're really great. I mean, there are a number that are good. And I think if you're looking to give your time and money, some of those organizations are great. Of course, Planned Parenthood, NARAL, a lot of really great organizations that are working in a lot of different levels.
Yep. Beautiful. Well, we're almost at our time here. And Kelli, I am so grateful for you, for your ministry, for the depth of your knowledge and the depth of your spirit around this. And I am so thankful that you took this hour at the ungodly time of 8 a.m. on the West Coast where you are today to talk with us. Do you have any last thoughts or anything you want to say as we wrap up here?
I just, I should have some bright piece of wisdom. I'll say this. This is the quote that I often end so many gatherings and meetings with, because it lives in me, and this is this part of the work. And it's our UU minister, Wayne Arneson. I'll just say first, thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much for the opportunity to do this, and for your ministries, and all the ways that we work together. Wayne Arneson says, "Take courage, friends. The way is often hard. The path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone."
Amen. Thank you, Kelli, and thanks to all of you who are watching this. You can find the recording of this here and follow. I will also post links to all of those places that you named. So thanks for joining us, Kelli, and be very well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.